Silence, Earthling! My name is Darth Vader. I am an extraterrestrial from the planet Vulcan.
It's not a stretch to say that many people consider Back to the Future one of the greatest movies of all time, and I am 100% in that camp. Right behind Rocky, this is on the top of the mountain for me. I grew up with this trilogy. My family owned the first two on VHS. I went to the 2015 screening of Part 2. I have posters, a replica sports almanac, Marty Jr.'s iridescent cap, a Lego DeLorean, the entire IDW comic book run, the animated series on DVD, the complete trilogy on Blu-ray, and even wrote my own version of Part 4, which I hope never actually happens in any form. I love these movies. And it all starts with objectively the best one, the original from 1985. Some of the behind-the-scenes troubles with this film have been fueling clickbait articles for years, so yes, we'll talk about Eric Stoltz's short run as Marty McFly before Michael J. Fox was brought in to replace him, but we'll also discuss Disney turning down the script, the many challenges on set, the first movie's cultural impact, my experience seeing the live stage musical, and much, much more. Fire up your time circuits, grab some plutonium, and hit the gas. We're taking Juniversal up to 88 miles per hour and beyond.
Look out!
It's 1985. Marty McFly is kind of the cool rebel at school with a girlfriend named Jennifer, an affinity for sketching, and an antagonistic relationship with his principal, Mr. Strickland. However, he has a bit of a troubled home life. His father, George, is still being taken advantage of by his high school bully, Biff. His uncle, Jailbird Joey, is in the slammer, and his mother, Lorraine, is a borderline alcoholic. Marty has an unlikely friendship with an eccentric old scientist-inventor named Dr. Emmett L. Brown. One night, he invites Marty to film his latest and greatest invention in action, a time-traveling DeLorean. To their shock, the thing actually works, but it runs on plutonium that Doc stole from Libyan nationalists, who soon show up to take their revenge. Doc is fired upon, seemingly killed, as Marty hops in the DeLorean to escape. Outrunning his friend's murderers, he takes the vehicle up to 88 miles per hour and travels back to the date set on the car's time circuits, November 5th, 1955. It was the day Doc first conjured up the flux capacitor, which is
what makes time travel possible.
Marty runs into the 1955 versions of his parents and Biff, eventually seeking out the younger Doc for help. After convincing him of his story, Marty's only chance to get home is revealed to be a bolt of lightning.
What did you say?
A bolt of lightning!
Charging up the flux capacitor. There just so happens to be one striking the Hill Valley Clock Tower in a few days, an event that infamously froze the clock in place. Doc and Marty make the necessary preparations before McFly's effects on the timeline slowly erase him and his siblings from existence. By 1980, Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis had written several screenplays together that were made into films, including Steven Spielberg's 1979 comedy, 1941. Columbia Pictures released the film Used Cars in 1980, which the Bobs wrote and Zemeckis directed. It didn't do well financially, but Columbia was impressed enough to help produce the next movie the pair wanted to make, and struck a deal for the duo to write 2 drafts of their next script. They both had always wanted to tell a time travel story, with Gale fascinated by the concept since he was a child, inspired by sci-fi TV shows and comic books. Zemeckis had always considered H.G. Wells's The Time Machine and A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens the best stories utilizing the concept. The genesis of the idea for Back to the Future kicked off with Bob Gale visiting his parents' house. He was looking through old boxes in the basement and came across his dad's yearbook. To his surprise, he found out his father was class president, and that got him thinking. Would he have been friends with his own dad in high school? The pair started writing in September of 1980. They used the index card method of plotting. Individual ideas were posted to a board, and they figured out how to sequence and connect them. Both Bobs described the writing process as very difficult and not fun, even though Zemeckis would later say this and the reactions to the film were his favorite parts of making it. The screenplay for Back to the Future is a textbook case of ideal setups and payoffs. They'd have everything from big plot points to minute details established early on and called back to later. This was their intention as they wrote, but it also made this initial stage quite arduous. The first draft was turned in after 5 months. Columbia requested some changes, and the Bobs returned 6 weeks later, now in the spring of 1981, with a new version. However, Columbia ended up turning it down. They thought it was a nice, sweet story, but were looking for a raunchier comedy at the time. Zemeckis and Gale then took their new work around town, but were constantly turned away. They did show it to their friend Steven Spielberg, and he did like it, thinking it was unusual and functioned on old-fashioned principles. The powerhouse director-producer believed in the project and was willing to help make it, but the Bobs were spooked by their collaborations with Spielberg, yielding his only financial failures. If this new film involved Spielberg and didn't succeed, their careers might not have recovered. So, they continued to pound the pavement and continued to receive rejections. Most of the studios they pitched it to kept telling them to take it over to Disney. Reluctantly, the Bobs did just that, and were met with a particularly memorable rebuff. An executive read the script and asked the writers if they were insane. The story was predicated on incest. Disney couldn't possibly be involved with something like that. At this point, Zemeckis was feeling the pressure and decided he had to direct another film. He took on 1984's Romancing the Stone, and it became the hit they needed. Suddenly, interest in Back to the Future dramatically increased. With the win finally under his belt, Zemeckis took the project back to Steven Spielberg. They secured a deal with Universal, and Back to the Future was finally set to actually happen. But they still had many hurdles to clear and heartbreak to endure.
I probably would like to travel into the future to see if this movie is going to be successful.
Universal president Sid Sheinberg became both a proponent and adversary to certain aspects of the movie once it was greenlit by the studio. Early on, he wanted a few alterations to the script. Among them were changing Professor Brown to Doc Brown and Marty's mother from Meg to Lorraine, which was also Sheinberg's wife's name. He also nixed Doc's pet chimp and replaced it with a dog because in his experience, movies with chimps didn't make any money. Finally, he gave Zemeckis and Company a mandate of having the film ready for a Memorial Day release or it would be canceled. This proved difficult when they had to push back the start date several times due to trouble finding the right actor to play the lead. The Bobs had always envisioned Michael J. Fox as Marty, but the actor's schedule working on the NBC comedy Family Ties made it impossible for him to commit. Showrunner Gary David Goldberg wouldn't even allow Fox to see the script. This left a conundrum for Zemeckis and Gale as they searched through a ton of actors to fill Marty's Nikes. As Bob Gale remembers it, 2 screen tests came to the forefront: Eric Stoltz and C. Thomas Howell. Howell was the clear frontrunner and, as the actor tells it, was on set for 2 weeks getting fitted for wardrobe and rehearsing with the cast. It was then an executive at Universal, likely Sheinberg, saw both screen tests and heavily pushed for Stoltz to get the lead. Not wanting to push production back anymore, Zemeckis acquiesced. He thought he could mold the right performance out of Stoltz, but would ultimately regret this thought process. Because it took so long to secure the Marty role, basically every other part had already been filled. The first choice for Doc was John Lithgow, but after that didn't work out, they went after Christopher Lloyd, who didn't have any interest at first. After being convinced to read the script and meeting with Robert Zemeckis, the actor changed his tune and came aboard. While Doc Brown had to be portrayed in 2 different eras, it was intended for Lloyd to play both. That wasn't always the case for the rest of the cast. The Bobs wanted to find young actors who could convincingly play older versions of their characters with the aid of makeup, but studio executives were considering getting older actors for the 1985 scenes. Makeup artist Kent Chase was brought in for several extensive makeup tests to prove the former could be accomplished. Earning the role of George McFly was the eccentric Crispin Glover. He had an unusual way of talking and strange mannerisms that came across great on screen. Behind the scenes, he'd clash with Gale and Zemeckis concerning many different details of his role, big and small. More on that later. Lea Thompson was brought on as Lorraine Baines McFly. She had just worked with Eric Stoltz on 1984's The Wildlife for Universal, so this seemed like a natural fit. Thompson had possibly the most believable varying portrayals of the same character at different ages. Thomas F. Wilson is said to be the opposite of Biff in real life, but his straight delivery of Tannen's comedic lines and intimidating physicality landed him the part of the antagonist. Wilson drew from his own personal experience of being picked on as a kid. The role of Biff very nearly went to J.J. Cohen, who ultimately played Skinhead in the final film. He really impressed Gale and Zemeckis with his take on the role, but his physical stature when compared to Eric Stoltz didn't create the appropriate visual of a larger bully. Gale admitted that if Michael J. Fox was in the role at the time of Biff's casting, Cohen could have come away with the part. Another role heavily affected by Marty's later recasting was that of Jennifer Parker. Claudia Wells actually had Jennifer locked up before they found the character's boyfriend, but because they kept pushing the start date back, she had to drop out and fulfill contracted appearances on a TV show. Melora Hardin was then cast as Jennifer, opposite Stoltz as McFly. The rest of the cast was populated with talented actors and memorable parts like Mark McClure, Wendy Jo Sperber, James Tolkien, and Harry Waters Jr. It was even Billy Zane's first movie. The time machine was a time chamber in the original script. Instead of a car, it was a refrigerator. Fears of kids locking themselves inside of their home fridges and Zemeckis' idea to make the time travel device mobile led to it becoming a vehicle. They went with a DeLorean because of the spaceship joke when Marty first arrives in 1955. The gull-wing doors were a perfect feature to showcase the time machine's unique and peculiar design. The add-ons to the car were drawn up by a concept artist and applied by special effects supervisor Kevin Pike and his crew. The idea was to make it look cool, but also as if it was constructed in someone's garage. They built 3 time machines. There was the main vehicle, one for driving shots and stunts, and another that was cut up for interiors and process work. There are only about 30-some optical effects in Back to the Future, most of them containing the DeLorean. These were achieved by old-fashioned means and industrial light and magic, including miniatures and other early Star Wars-esque methods. The production team at first wanted Hill Valley to be an on-location setting. They searched through old coal mining towns in Northern California, but they discovered they wouldn't have the amount of control over the area that was needed to pull off the more challenging aspects of the film. That's when they opted for Universal's famous backlot. The plan was to make everything look retro pristine for the 1955 material, then dirty it up for all the 1985 scenes. They completely reinvented the courthouse square in a way that hasn't been done since, adding the clock and pediment to City Hall and the large grass area in front of it. Director of photography Dean Cundy also planned on shooting the 50s time period with a warmer color palette. He lit everything softer to be more akin to films from that decade. In contrast, the 1980s sequences were lit with truer color for a slightly different feeling. On-location shooting did take place at Puente Hills Mall and Whittier High School in California. All the Hill Valley High exteriors and interior hallway shots were filmed at Whittier to showcase its old-fashioned look. The Enchantment Under the Sea dance also needed a gymnasium that wasn't recently renovated, and they found one at Hollywood United Methodist Church. The church actually still hosts its own Enchantment Under the Sea dance annually, attracting fans of the trilogy. Back to the Future officially started shooting in November of 1984. Robert Zemeckis would later say he didn't have a single good memory of making it. He was in survival mode the entire time on set. He recalled how it was always cold and he barely slept. It was the unhealthiest he'd ever been in his life. Zemeckis and Gale butted heads with Crispin Glover. The actor had a few wild ideas about his character and was pushing back against some of the direction. They described him as being off about 50% of the time, and they had to rein him in often. Glover had a real problem with the end of the movie and where the McFlys ended up. It's a point that Zemeckis didn't totally disagree with, but it was supposedly like pulling teeth just to get him to wear the selected wardrobe. When it came to Back to the Future Part 2, things got ugly between Crispin and the Bobs, but that's a story for another time. Adding to the director's stress was the whole situation with Eric Stoltz. They shot for 5 to 6 weeks with him as Marty, but it was apparent something wasn't working. His comedy sensibilities didn't match up with what the Bobs had written, and it was actively affecting the direction of the picture. Reportedly, he was just taking things too seriously. Tom Wilson commented on his work with Stoltz decades later by saying he had issues with the lead's physical method acting. In the scenes where Marty and Biff tussled, Stoltz was so into the role that he got a bit aggressive with Wilson. During the filming of the parking lot sequence, Zemeckis finally threw in the towel. After showing Steven Spielberg dailies of the performance in question, the executive producer agreed. A change was desperately needed. It wasn't that Stoltz was a bad actor, he was just miscast as Marty. The director and his producers let Eric go, and then broke the news to a shocked cast and crew. Zemeckis and Spielberg somehow convinced Sid Sheinberg to okay the move and pay for over a month's worth of reshoots. They then once again reached out to Gary David Goldberg in hopes of acquiring Michael J. Fox. The Family Ties showrunner agreed to let Fox read the script only if Back to the Future was willing to shoot around his sitcom schedule. Everyone agreed to the terms, and Michael J. Fox was given the script. He was willing to put up with a brutal schedule to take the job. The young actor would shoot Family Ties during the day from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., then head over to shoot Back to the Future overnight from about 6 p.m. into the wee hours of the morning. He only got about an hour or two of sleep every night. Fox was even working weekends since those were the only times during daylight hours he was available for the movie. He loved having the opportunity, but this schedule took its toll. Sometimes he'd mix up Marty with his Alex Keaton character from Family Ties. Fox was exhausted and couldn't get a true sense of how he'd come off in the film because he was so sleep-deprived. When Marty was recast, the Jennifer Parker character was destined for a change-up as well. According to the Bobs, female executives at Universal complained that Melora Hardin was too tall for Michael J. Fox, and they didn't want to emasculate their male lead. At this point, Hardin had already shot publicity stills and was on set for some of the scenes with Eric Stoltz, but had yet to appear on camera. With heavy hearts, Zemeckis and Gale called to release her from the project. Hardin was just 17 years old at the time and devastated by the news. Since reshoots were on the horizon and the crew had to start from scratch in many ways, the production schedule was again delayed. While all of this was happening, Claudia Wells had finished up her TV commitment and became available again. She was brought back as Jennifer Parker, and the director and producers finally had the pair of actors they wanted in the first place on screen together. The reshoots gave Zemeckis and Company a second bite at the apple. They were able to adjust when needed and improve what they had already shot. Some things were approached the exact same as before, but other instances were done in a way that made work easier for the crew. They didn't need to waste time on certain setups that they knew didn't land the first time. The production team liked what they were putting together, but they weren't exactly expecting Back to the Future to be a record-breaking hit. They were just hoping the film would break even. But, as shooting rolled on, they realized they underestimated the popularity of their star. Kids and girls were lined up to see him a few different times on set. Family Ties had made Michael J. Fox a massive star, and this was the perfect project to shoot his celebrity status into the stratosphere. Back to the Future wrapped shooting on April 20th, 1985. The whirlwind that came next transformed the movie from a fun sci-fi adventure into a legendary Hollywood blockbuster. The film score for Back to the Future is one of the most well-known of the 1980s and well beyond. It brought an excitement and ethos to the picture that greatly enhanced what was already shaping up to be something special. Robert Zemeckis had just worked with Alan Silvestri on Romancing the Stone, but this was a totally different beast and needed an epic accompaniment. When Silvestri was brought to set, Zemeckis kept telling him the music had to be big. It needed to go against trends at the time of scoring movies on the box, which meant on a synthesizer. The composer took those instructions to heart. He brought together an 80 to 85-piece orchestra, the largest ever assembled for a Universal movie at the time. Because the schedule was so tight, the director wasn't privy to a single note until it came time to record. Needless to say, he was blown away by what he heard. On a personal level, I probably listen to the Back to the Future movie score more than any other. It never fails to create a sense of dramatic adventure or draw the appropriate emotion. The softer portions do so much to humanize Marty, his desperation to get home, and his relationships to those around him, especially with Doc. I'd go as far to say that most film fans wouldn't disagree with categorizing the music here as among the best ever put to screen. Alan Silvestri wasn't the only contributor to the movie's iconic soundtrack. Huey Lewis and the News were a popular musical act at the time, as the album Sports was topping the charts with hits like Heart and Soul and The Heart of Rock and Roll. Zemeckis got Lewis involved, and the musician became part of the DNA of the film. Lewis contributed the popular hits Power of Love and Back in Time, the first of which set the vibe of the movie perfectly and proved to have a staying power that has stretched all the way up to present day. Lewis also has a memorable cameo that he loved shooting.
I'm afraid you're just too darn loud.
The turnaround time for the movie's first preview screening was incredibly fast. It took place in San Jose, California, just 3 weeks after production officially wrapped. The audience had no idea what they were about to watch. The only details given were that the film was a comedy starring Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd. Even though the version they saw was incomplete, featuring only portions of the final score, unfinished effects, and an overly long Darth Vader sequence, the audience communicated one undeniable fact. Back to the Future was going to be a hit. People were jumping to their feet and gave a handful of spontaneous applause breaks. Universal clearly had something here. It was the highest scoring preview screening they ever had up to that point. Sid Sheinberg attended the second preview screening and was so impressed, he moved up the release date. Following the initial production delays, it was scheduled to hit theaters on August 16, 1985, but the president of Universal wanted Back to the Future to start playing by July 4th weekend so it could run throughout the summer. The new debut target drastically sped up post-production. Many more sound crew members were hired on, working in shifts 24 hours a day to finish the film. Zemeckis had to approve a few rushed optical effects by Industrial Light and Magic that still stick out to him to this day, but there was no other choice. Back to the Future was barreling toward July 3rd with nothing else slowing it down. One of the only things that may have stood in the way of its success was a questionable name change. Sheinberg had been against the title of the movie for as long as Universal was producing it. He didn't think it made sense and would confuse audiences. His suggested title? Spaceman from Pluto. I know what you're thinking. Yes, that does sound awful, but it at least made a tiny bit of sense since that was close to the title of the comic book the kid was reading during the barn scene. He made several suggestions on ways to tie the title into the rest of the movie, such as Marty saying his makeshift Darth Vader was from the planet Pluto. Obviously, this was a bad idea, and both Bobs and Steven Spielberg knew it. The latter sent Sheinberg a note that said they all laughed at his joke, pretending not to take the studio president's suggestion seriously. Spielberg knew he'd be too embarrassed to push for it after that, and it was never brought up again. The marketing for Back to the Future gave us some memorable material. That first trailer has all original footage, showcasing the DeLorean's sci-fi electronics and very little of Michael J. Fox until the very end.
How far are you going?
About 30 years.
A much more 80s piece of music underscored the visuals, with Huey Lewis's Back in Time finishing the trailer off. They recreated it with Fox for the film's 25th anniversary in 2010. Drew Struzan's poster is up there with Jaws as one of the most iconic one-sheets ever. Marty's pose, the DeLorean's gull-wing door, and the flames behind the vehicle create a stunning composition. I love the tagline too. He was never in time for his classes. He wasn't in time for his dinner. Then one day, he wasn't in his time at all. Brilliant. I'm a longtime owner of that poster and display it proudly. 9.5 weeks after they filmed their final shot, Back to the Future was in theaters. But even with the strong previews, Robert Zemeckis was terrified it wouldn't find its audience. He didn't like the TV spots, and Michael J. Fox was unavailable to promote the film because he was shooting a Family Ties TV movie in London. It's very likely no one involved realized they were about to unleash on the world a timeless, indelible piece of pure pop culture. Marty succeeds in finally bringing his parents together just before he's fully erased. After dangerous problems arise during Doc's attempt to send McFly back to 1985, they triumph by the skin of their teeth. Marty arrives in his home era and immediately tries to save Doc from being shot, but fails to arrive in time. However, he sees that Brown taped together his young friend's warning from decades prior and wore a bulletproof vest. As Doc finally embarks on his journey into the future, Marty sees that the McFlys have changed for the better. His father is a budding sci-fi author, his mother is much healthier and happier, and both his siblings are productive members of society. Jennifer is still his girlfriend, and they plan on a weekend getaway. But Doc shows up in the DeLorean with a foreboding message about the couple's future kids. All three hop into the vehicle, which has been given a few upgrades.
Roads? Where we're going, we don't need roads.
Back to the Future drew in over $11 million on the extended 4th of July weekend. The numbers that certified its hit status, though, came the following weekend, where it grossed even more than its debut. Audiences flocked to theaters, creating the sensation of the summer. The film was number 1 for 11 out of 12 weeks and soon became a hit around the world. It ended up the highest-grossing film of 1985, surpassing Rambo 2, Rocky IV, The Goonies, The Breakfast Club, and more recognizable features from that year. The majority of critics praised the movie and its performances. Only a few, mostly in Europe as Robert Zemeckis remembered, had an issue with the overly materialistic ending. They had the same gripes Crispin Glover expressed on set about the McFlys focusing too much on the items they possessed instead of love for one another. Marty's new truck and a much nicer looking home are definitely showcased prominently, but it seems to me that was all used as a visual representation of the family's success in believing in themselves. George finally got to write his novel. He raised his family to do the work and follow their passions. And standing up for himself and his future wife led to a much healthier relationship. That's what I think of more with that final scene, but I can understand how the 4x4, Dave's suit he always wears to the office, and George and Lorraine's higher class looks might rub some folks the wrong way. At the 1986 Academy Awards, Back to the Future took home 1 Oscar and was nominated for 3 more. It won for Best Sound Effects Editing and was among the best of the year in the Best Screenplay, Original Song for Power of Love, and Best Sound categories. I'm shocked Alan Silvestri's musical score didn't at least receive a nomination, but it also wasn't nominated for Best Picture. Maybe with a more dignified title like Spaceman from Pluto, it would have gotten a little more respect. While you'd think the final sequence with Doc, Marty, and Jennifer going into the future was an obvious sequel tease, it was written as a complete joke, not meant to be taken seriously. A sequel to the original film wasn't even really on the Bobs' minds at first. They always cite the Jennifer character being in the DeLorean as something they wouldn't have done if an immediate continuation was the plan. But because of the massive success of the 1985 classic, continue they did. To Be Continued was added on home video releases, and work on a sequel began. Now, the details surrounding the rest of the trilogy each deserve their own video, but in general, they initially planned on making one huge sequel called Paradox that included most of the material that was eventually featured in parts 2 and 3, but during production, they decided to split Paradox into 2 films. Back to the Future Part 2 and Back to the Future Part 3 came out 6 months apart in 1989 and 1990. They finished the story on the big screen and definitively closed the door on any more movie sequels. Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis have been adamant since the shooting of Part 3 that another film should never, ever be made. Yet, that doesn't stop people from always asking them in just about every interview they've given in the ensuing years. Their answer has remained consistent, and as long as they're both alive to stop Universal, it seems another Back to the Future movie, spin-off series, etc. isn't in the cards. But who knows what will happen way down the line? Will the studio still respect the Bob's wishes decades after they're gone? We'll see. The franchise has continued in other ways. There was a 26-episode cartoon series that started airing in 1991. It's famous for introducing the world to Bill Nye the Science Guy. For more thoughts on that show, check out my review on Walter Culture. Earlier that year, Back to the Future: The Ride was first launched at Orlando's Universal Studios. It featured new footage with Christopher Lloyd and Thomas F. Wilson reprising their characters from the movies. Never having the chance to ride that attraction has got to be my biggest disappointment when it comes to this franchise. It closed in 2007 at both US locations and in 2016 at Universal Studios Japan. In the US, it was replaced by the Simpsons ride, which, sucks. So. The DeLorean and the Time Train are still on display in Orlando, and Universal has continued to utilize elements from the franchise in other ways. The Destination Hill Valley event at the Hollywood location is a prime example of that. It looked like the ultimate fan experience, as they had actors playing out scenes from the movie at the actual Courthouse Square filming location. In 2010, a Telltale video game, Back to the Future: The Game, released its first segment. It continued past the events of Part 3 and told the story of Marty traveling back to the 1930s. I never played it myself, but I did watch full compilations of all the cutscenes and read the Citizen Brown comic book that based its story on the games. Just this year, Bob Gale hinted at the possibility of a new game coming out, so maybe we'll get another chance to play as our favorite characters from the films. In 2015, IDW Publishing started releasing comic books that became a popular ongoing series. I own them all in trade paperback form and can say it's a hit-and-miss collection of stories. My favorite is probably the Biff to the Future arc, where we see Biff Tannen's rise to prominence in the 1985A timeline from the second film. I was also pleasantly surprised by the Transformers crossover they did in 2020 and 2021. In 2024, I was able to check out Back to the Future the Musical when it came to Chicago. The music they came up with to go along with the story is okay. I'm not really the best judge of that kind of thing. There weren't too many catchy tunes, I could say that. But the effects they did live on stage for anything featuring the DeLorean were unbelievable. It was worth it just to see that. Through all these means and much more, like a ton of merchandise over the years, Back to the Future has proven to be timeless. Its influence over culture and other films since its release is evident. Indiana Jones may have even taken a cue from the franchise in the form of the 1985 movie's original climax. The infamous nuking the fridge scene from 2008's Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is possibly inspired by the time machine initially being nuclear-powered and Marty getting back to 1985 by way of atomic explosion. There's a whole storyboard sequence on the Blu-ray with an option for commentary by Bob Gale, and it's a fascinating watch. At first, McFly was going to get home by sneaking onto a nuclear test site in Nevada or New Mexico and driving the DeLorean straight into a nuke. It was still in the script when they started shooting, but budget concerns forced Gale and Zemeckis to improvise, and we got the famous clock tower sequence instead. I adore how the finale turned out. It's one of the best climaxes I've ever seen, but that original ending sounds like it would have been one hell of a finish. I would have loved to have seen how they might have put that together. Somewhere, in an alternate timeline, they had an extra million or two and made it happen. Back to the Future is my favorite trilogy of all time. I love it more than the original Star Wars trilogy, more than Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight series, the Godfather movies, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films, and I didn't grow up with Lord of the Rings, so for me, it tops them too. A lot of these films either have inconsistency within their respective trilogies, or others I didn't mention continued on past a third movie when they shouldn't have. Looking at you, Indiana Jones and Toy Story. The three Back to the Future movies aren't perfect, don't get me wrong. The first movie gets the closest, but if I'm being honest, the second one's my personal favorite. I just love how it went into the first film from a different perspective. 3, though, it has its moments. It's clearly the weak link to me, but I still love it. Outside of, Power Rangers, this was my first real fandom. I can't remember a time where I wasn't watching Back to the Future. Sitting down to view those old VHS tapes was a bonding experience for me and my family when I was younger, and I became very attached to these characters and their adventures. Marty and Doc are the greatest on-screen duo ever. I'd put them up against any other two-man team. I'm sure I'm biased in this opinion because of my history with the franchise, but I really feel like the first Back to the Future is the most rewatchable movie. There are so many new things to discover on every viewing. So many background details and line deliveries and musical moments and captivating behind-the-scenes stories still keep me and millions of other fans coming back 40 years after it was first released. 2025 is the 40th anniversary of the first film. It's wild to think about. We're well past the future now. The story Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis constructed holds firm. And there is no need for a fourth film or a live-action TV series or whatever spin-off the guys from Cobra Kai want to do. It'd probably go on for 3 seasons too long anyway. No, leave it alone. A fourth movie can be fun to ponder about as a thought experiment, but that's where it should stop. There are ways you can explore the history of Hill Valley without encroaching on the integrity of the film trilogy. I think comic books and video games are the perfect way to do it. Maybe a new animated series at some point, but that's a gigantic maybe. It would depend on what exactly that potential cartoon would be covering. As Robert Zemeckis would say, the trilogy isn't perfect, but it's perfect enough. Was this video long enough for you? There's a ton of information out there about the making of the first movie, so I had a lot to get through. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, check out my personal channel that I mentioned earlier, Walter Culture, and join me next time on Juniversal as we travel 4 years into the future for a sentimental look at America's pastime.
It's a nice round number.
Look me up when you get there, all right?